Americans in the first half of the 19th century are going to describe liberty as the defining quality of our new nation and its institutions. Americans are going to celebrate freedom in their political speeches, their writings, newspapers, and sermons even, and this freedom is going to be what was said to make these American institutions very unique. However, during this time period, Americans' understandings of what freedom is changes. The Revolution and the War of Independence are going to stimulate three historical processes that are also going to quicken quite a bit after the War of 1812. This is the spread of market relations, westward migration, and the development of a very active political democracy. These forces reshape American society and are going to lead Americans to associate freedom with economic opportunity, the ability to move about in the country, and participate in the democracy. Slavery is also going to shape American freedom. It's going to move west and expand along with the nation. Innovations in transportation are going to actually help spread slaves and slavery. And slavery is going to create a racial boundary around American democracy that makes voting, office holding, and political participation a privilege for whites only. So in this chapter, we're going to be looking at the new economy, the market society, what the free individual is, and the limits of prosperity. In this first section, we're going to be talking about the main elements of the market revolution. Now, in the first half of the 19th century, economic changes are called by historians as the market revolution are going to transform the United States. Innovations in transportation and communication sparked these changes. In the colonial era, technology had barely advanced. Ships did not become faster, no canals were built, manufacturing was done by hand. Roads were very scarce and slow. In 1800, most farm families were not tied to the marketplace. They used very little cash and produced much of what they needed in the home. It was nearly impossible for farmers far from cities or waterways to get their produce to market and also to get items from another place. The first advance in overland transportation was the construction of toll roads, and these were called turnpikes. These were done by private companies and state and local governments. Improved water transportation more effectively sped up and lowered the cost of commerce. And in 1807 on the Hudson River in New York, the first steamboat, which was built by Robert Fulton, went into operation. Steamboats are going to be what makes it possible for upstream navigation and for rapid transport across the Great Lakes and eventually the Atlantic Ocean. In 1825, the Erie Canal in upstate New York was completed. This canal facilitated the settlement of upstate New York and the Old Northwest, and it also helped to foster trade between farmers in the West and manufacturers in the East. The Erie Canal also inspired a craze of canal building by state and local governments, many of which became bankrupt when the canals were unprofitable. Here you see an 1810 advertisement for a stagecoach route, which is linking Boston and Sandwich, Massachusetts. It shows you in this ad the slow speed and the high cost of land transportation in the early 19th century. You'll notice it took nearly an entire day. They started at 5 a.m., cost around $50 in today's money to travel just 57 miles between towns. And it had included stops along the way for breakfast and for lunch. You can see here on this map shows the canals and roads in 1840. You can see that the improvement of existing roads and the building of new roads and canals is what's going to reduce the transportation times and costs. And this is going to help stimulate the growth of the market economy. You see here, this is an 1837 copy of a color drawing that accompanied a patent application for a type of raft that was designed in 1818. For many years, rafts like this one were what were used to transport goods and markets on these western rivers. You can see this view of New York City in 1849. This was done by a very famous lithographer, Nathaniel Creer. You can see he's showing steamships and sailing vessels of various sizes in the harbor of our nation's largest city, and it's also the busiest port. Now, while canals only connected existing waterways, railroads opened a new area in the interior, and it stimulated coal mining for fuel, iron manufacturing for locomotives and rail as well. Work on the first railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, began in 1828. By 1860, the nation's rail network was about 30,000 miles long, more than the total in the rest of the world combined. At the same time, the invention of the telegraph in the 1830s by Samuel F.B. Morse allowed for instantaneous communication. First used commercially in 1844, the telegraph served businesses and newspapers by helping speed the information flow and by bringing uniformity in prices. Transportation and communication improvements also fostered the growth of the West as a new region. Between 1790 and 1840, about 4.5 million people crossed the Appalachian Mountains. Much of this was after the War of 1812, when very land-hungry Easterners were going to be moving west. Between 1815 and 1821, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Alabama, Mississippi, and Maine are all going to become states. 3 different streams of settlers are going to move west. There are small farmers and planters with slaves in the south, and these are going to create the Cotton Kingdom of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas. Farm families of the upper south who moved to southern Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and the New Englanders who moved across New York to northern Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. National boundaries did not prevent American settlement in Florida, and later in Texas and Oregon, American settlers are going to claim land that is being currently ruled by foreign countries like Spain, Mexico, and Britain, or land that is being or has been lived on by Native Americans. They were confident that their American sovereignty would follow. American settlers and military incursions, some which were led by Andrew Jackson, led to the acquisition of Spanish Florida by 1819. By 1840, 7 million Americans, about 2/5 of the total population, lived west of the Appalachian Mountains. Here we have an 1827 engraving that is really designed to show the feasibility of railroads that are driven by steam-powered locomotives. And it's dedicated to the president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which began construction the year following, in 1828. The engraver placed passengers as far from the locomotive as possible to show their safety in case of an explosion. You see it clear in the back. This is a watercolor by Edwin Whitefield. It depicts a squatter's cabin in the Minnesota woods. You can see where settlers are moving towards Minnesota. Here we have a map that shows the first 2 decades of the 19th century and the westward movement of the population that was brought by settlement to and across the Mississippi River. Now, before canals and later railroads opened previously landlocked areas to commercial farming, settlement had been concentrated near the rivers. You can see the travel times as new innovations like the steamship and locomotive are introduced. Shows how these makes it much more rapid travel within the United States. And this is the population growth of some of the western states. You can see how in just 40 years, how much people have moved westward. Now, the market revolution and westward expansion, which occurred at the same time in the North and South, increased divisions between those sections. Perhaps probably the most dynamic characteristic of America's economy in this early 19th century was the birth of the Cotton Kingdom. The early Industrial Revolution in England was based in cotton textile factories, which demanded a huge amount of cotton. The Deep South was very suited to growing cotton, and once Eli Whitney in 1793 invented the cotton gin, which quickly separated the cotton from the seeds, cotton production in the United States quickened and became very profitable and spread. Whitney's invention, along with new western lands and factory demand for cotton, revolutionized American slavery. Once expected to die out with tobacco, slavery was actually expanded by cotton. When Congress outlawed the Atlantic slave trade in 1808, there was a massive internal trade in slaves that grew in the United States. This is in which slaves in the older slave states of Maryland, Virginia, and South Carolina were sold to newer slave areas in the Deep South. Between 1800 and 1860, about 1 million slaves were sold and forcibly moved west in our internal slave trade. And though Jefferson imagined the West would secure the future of an American republic populated by independent small farmers, slave plantations producing cotton for export became the basis of this empire of liberty. This enslaved trader sold to Tennessee. It's a watercolor sketch by Lewis Miller, and it's from about the mid-1850s, and Miller showing a group of slaves being marched from Virginia to Tennessee. Now, once Congress voted to prohibit the further importation of slaves in the country, slave owners in newly opened areas of the country had to find slaves from other parts of the United States. You can see here on this map shows cotton production graphically to illustrates the rise of the Cotton Kingdom that stretches from South Carolina to Louisiana. Now, in this next section, we're going to be looking at how the market revolution sparked social change. Now, even though cotton agriculture in some sense commercialized the South, it did not create a thriving and diverse economy. Cotton plantation slavery simply spread the agrarian, slave-based social order of the eastern states, just moved them westward. Now, the Cotton Kingdom remained rural, and the South's transportation and banking systems were very underdeveloped parts of this plantation economy. Manufacturing and technological development lagged in the South when compared to the North. In the North, the market revolution and westward expansion encouraged changes that transformed the region into an integrated economy of commercial farms and manufacturing cities. Farmers who had once been isolated were now connected to distant markets by new transportation routes and by credit. They sold more goods, acquired more cash, in which they used to purchase more goods once they made at home, that they had once made at home. Western farmers sold their goods and found credit in growing eastern cities, and this credit allowed them to purchase land, fertilizers, new agricultural machines like the steel plow and the reaper, which are going to greatly increase their agricultural productivity in goods such as wheat. And cities were part of the West from its beginning. Cities stood at the center of the intersection of inter-regional trade, such as Cincinnati, which is the center of pig slaughterhouses, in St. Louis, grew enormously and quickly. Chicago was the West's greatest city, and thanks to the railroad and its location on the Great Lakes, Chicago by 1860 was the fourth largest city in the nation. It served as the center where Western farm products were collected and then shipped east. Urban centers in the West and East experienced great changes, which were brought on by the market revolution. The number of people in cities increased dramatically. Urban merchants, bankers, and master craftsmen exploited the expanding market among commercial farmers. Their efforts to increase production and reduce labor costs transformed the type of work that was being done. Artisans who once made an entire product at home, where they controlled their own work, were now gathered into large workshops where entrepreneurs were going to supervise them. They subdivided their tasks, paid them a wage to perform only one process in production, and these workers faced relentless pressure from employers to make more goods faster and at lower wages. This is a painting of Cincinnati, with self-styled Queen City of the West from 1835. You can see the steamboats that are lying the Ohio River riverfront. Here is this map of the major cities in 1840. Now, although the United States was still predominantly agricultural, by 1840 major cities had arisen in the northern and northwestern states. The South lagged very far behind in urban growth. Most cities were located on navigable waterways, either at the Atlantic coast or inland rivers, or on rivers that provided water power for early factories. In some industries, particularly textiles or fabrics, factories entirely replaced traditional craft production. Factories gathered large groups of workers under a central supervisor and replaced hand tools with power-driven machinery. The first factory in America was established in 1790 at Pawtucket, Rhode Island, by Samuel Slater, and he was an English immigrant who built from memory a spinning jenny in order to evade laws making it illegal to export plans for industrial machines. So instead of breaking the law by bringing the plan, He just memorized them and did that from memory. These early spinning factories are going to produce yarn through the outwork system was sent out to rural farm families who wove it into cloth. The same outwork system characterized early shoe production, in which parts were sent out to families who assembled them and gave them back to merchants who finally sold the shoe. But shoemaking and textiles were eventually brought all together under one roof. The first large American factory that used power looms to weave cloth or cotton cloth was built in Waltham, Massachusetts in 1814. Beginning in the 1820s, other manufacturers established factories in Lowell and other small towns, and they were creating small industrial towns and cities across New England as well. The first factories were powered by waterfalls and river rapids and were matched by the 1840s by factories using steam power, which could be located anywhere. In 1850, factories made not just textiles and shoes, but a wide variety of goods, including tools, firearms, clocks, and agricultural machinery. The American system of manufacturers relied on mass production of interchangeable parts that could be quickly assembled into a standardized finished product. The American system was really focused on creating the parts to the product and that were interchangeable so that it could very quickly be produced and assembled and put together. You can see here in this map of cotton mills. This is early industrial revolution was concentrated in New England, where the factories producing textiles from raw cotton sprang up along the region's many rivers, taking advantage of water power in order to drive their machinery. Now, the market revolution changed American sense of time as well. Farm life was still regulated by seasonal rhythms. Clocks in cities and factories came to sharply regulate life and distinguish work from leisure time. Artisans in traditional craft production had worked slowly and erratically and sometimes, stopping to drink or talk politics, but work in industrial factories was much longer, supervised, controlled, and drink, play, and conversation were not allowed in this very highly disciplined environment. Pay for the artisan had been based on the price of the product, but for the industrial worker, it was an hourly or daily wage. Railroads, which operated on a fixed schedule, also spread clock time. Many Americans saw working in a factory as degrading their sense of independence, and most native-born men refused to work in them. Employers thus turned to women and immigrants for labor. Most early New England factories used female and child labor. In Lowell, the most well-known center of early textile manufacturing, employers actually built an entire town with church, lecture halls, boarding halls that allowed farm families to send their daughters to a moral mill village in good conscience. This was the first time that women were sent into the public world in large numbers. These mill girls were very transient labor force, since most of them really sought to marry after only a few years of factory work, and so they were replaced by the immigrants in the 1840s and 1850s. Now, this is a broadside from 1853 that showed the hours working in the textile mills. You'll notice it was 12 hours a day, 30 minutes for lunch, and in the Lowell mills and the way factory labor, you can really see how it was very restricted by the clock. You can see the different bells, when they rang, what they rang for. It's very, very much regulated that way. Here you can see a picture of women tending machines in the Lowell textile mills. Now, economic growth fueled the demand for labor, which is partly filled by immigrants. Immigration swelled between 1840 and 1860 when over 4 million people came to the United States, mostly from Ireland and Germany. Modernization of agriculture, the Industrial Revolution, and the steamship and rail transportation spurred many of these migrants to America. Most went to the north, where jobs were plenty and slaves were few and would not compete with them. Very few immigrants went to the southern states except for larger peripheral cities like New Orleans, St. Louis, or Baltimore. Immigrants in northern cities and rural areas were very visible. America offered political and religious freedom to Europeans that had been living under repressive governments and very rigid social hierarchies. But the largest number of immigrants had come to the United States to flee catastrophe. Irish men and women who escaped from the Great Famine of 1845 to 1851, when a potato blight starved 1 million Irish to death and caused another million to migrate, mostly to America. These migrants, mostly having worked in agricultural labor, moved into unskilled or low-skilled jobs, men into common labor on the rail and canal construction, longshore and factory work, and women into domestic service. Germans were the second largest group of immigrants during this time period. They had more skilled workers, tended to be artisans, craftsmen, shopkeepers, and they formed tight-knit immigrant communities in the East and in the West. You can see in this chart shows the number of immigrants coming into the United States. Here's a photograph of young women workers from textile mills. Now, a lot of times our image of the West, we think of this lone pioneer settling out far away from everything. Many migrants settled in very tightly knit communities and worked together. And this is a painting by Olaf Krantz, who came to the United States from Sweden with his family in 1850. When he came, he was 12, and what he's showing in this painting is a group of women that are preparing to plant corn, and this is at the immigrant settlement of Bishop Hill, Illinois. Now, while English immigrants were very easily absorbed into American culture, the Irish faced bitter hostility. They were Roman Catholics in mostly Protestant society with a very deep anti-Catholic tradition. And as they increased the visibility and the power of Catholic Church, Irish immigrants in the 1840s and 1850s alarmed many native-born Americans and nativists who feared the impact of immigration on American political and social life. Now, these nativists blamed immigrants for crime, political corruption, heavy drinking, and job competition that would undercut wages for native-born skilled workers. The Irish were rapidly integrated into the Democratic Party's urban political machines, which then dispensed jobs and relief to immigrants in return for votes. Nativists believed the Irish in particular were very lazy, childlike, irrational people that were unfamiliar with American ideas of liberty and were subservient to the Catholic Church, thus threatening democratic institutions, social reform, and public education. Riots targeted immigrants and their institution, and nativist politicians were elected in the 1840s and 1850s. You can see the sources of immigration coming into the United States during this time period. Now, American law in this period increasingly supported the efforts of entrepreneurs to be able to participate in the market revolution while protecting them from local governments and liability that might interfere with their activities. The corporate form of business organization, in which a firm receives a charter from the government, there are stockholders that are not individually liable for company debts, is going to become central to economic life during this time period. Corporations found reinforcement in Supreme Court decisions that validated their legal status. Local courts found businesses blameless for property damage and held that employers had full authority in the workplace. They even convicted workers who joined unions or went on strike based on old conspiracy laws. So what we're seeing is that the law during this time period is very much going to be on the side of the business owners and not on the workers. And this is going to be something that's going to stick around until the early 1900s, this idea that business or government is not going to regulate business very much. This next section, we're going to look at how the meanings of American freedom is going to change during this time period. By the 1830s and 1840s, the market revolution and westward expansion had really affected all of Americans' lives. It reinforced older ideas of freedom, and it also created new ones. American freedom had long been linked with the idea of available land in the West. In this period was coined the phrase manifest destiny, and this referred to the divine mission of the United States to occupy all of North America and extend freedom despite any cost to people and nations already there. But an old idea connecting freedom and divine mission to move west and settle the land had its origins in colonial time. A national myth and ideology that the West would long remain a sanctuary for the free American. To many, the settlement and exploitation of the West offered America a chance to avoid becoming like Europe, where society was marked by fixed social classes and large numbers of wage-earning poor. In the West, free or cheap land was abundant, factory labor was less common, and the West seemed to offer men who might otherwise have to work wage labor and have faced rising land prices in the East, gave them an opportunity to gain economic independence, which was the social condition of freedom. Now, the energetic competitive world of the market revolution led many Americans to identify freedom with the absence of restraints on self-directed individuals who sought economic advancement and personal development. Opportunities for personal growth presented a new definition of Jefferson's pursuit of happiness that well fitted a new America in which Western expansion and market relations shattered old spatial and social boundaries. A group of New England intellectuals called Transcendentalists reflected this national mood in their writings and activities. Together, they insisted that individual judgment should take precedence over social traditions and institutions. Ralph Waldo Emerson defined freedom as an open-ended process for self-realization in which individuals could remake themselves and their own lives. Henry David Thoreau called for individuals to rely on themselves. And in this era, the term individualism is first used. Now, unlike the colonial period, many Americans now believe that individuals should pursue their own self-interest, no matter what the cost was to public good, and they should and could depend only on themselves. Americans more and more saw the realm of the private self as one in which other individuals and government should not interfere. Now, this is a daguerreotype, an early form of photography of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And for this type of photography, the individual being photographed would have to sit perfectly still for at least 20 seconds. Ralph Waldo Emerson, which you see here, did not like the result. He complained in his journal that his zeal not to blur the image, every muscle had become rigid, his face was fixed in a frown, as in madness or in death. So he's not a big fan of his own picture. Now, the popular religious revivals that swept over the nation during the Second Great Awakening added a religious dimension to the celebration of self-improvement, self-reliance, and self-determination. These first revivals were organized by established religious leaders who had begun to worry about low levels of church attendance, and they reached their height in the 1820s and 1830s when the Reverend Charles Grandison Finney held revivals in New York. Like evangelicals in the 18th century, Finney very enthusiastically warned his audience of hell, promised them salvation if they would end their sinful habits. And evangelical preachers during this time period rejected the idea that man was naturally sinful and preordained to heaven or hell. And instead, they argued that humans had free will to live in sin or to reach heaven by doing good works. The Second Great Awakening democratized American Christianity, made it a mass enterprise. Religious devotion and attendance boomed. Smaller evangelical sects such as Methodists and Baptists grew rapidly. Christianity is going to become central to American culture during the Second Great Awakening. The evangelicals are going to stress the right of private judgment in spiritual affairs and the possibility of universal salvation through faith and good deeds. Evangelicals use the opportunities to travel and spread their message, all which had been made available by the market revolution, and their mass religion and idea that ordinary Americans could kind of forge their own spiritual destiny very much resonated with the spread of market values. While evangelicals criticized selfishness and greed and indifference to the welfare of others, the revivals flourished in areas transformed by the market revolution. Evangelical ministers promoted a controlled individualism that is marked by industry, sobriety, self-discipline, and the essence of freedom. You can see here this watercolor of a religious camp meeting shows the evangelical preacher at a revival meeting during the Second Great Awakening. You can see some of the audience members seem inattentive, others are moved by his fiery sermon, not unlike some of our churches today. This is the New Jerusalem, an early 19th century watercolor. And in German, it illustrates the narrow gateway to heaven and the fate that awaits sinners in hell. And these were common themes of preachers during the Second Great Awakening. One of the lasting and largest Second Great Awakening religious communities was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, whose members are most often referred to as Mormons. Joseph Smith, claiming to have found ancient tablets which he transcribed as the Book of Mormon, founded the church in the late 1820s in upstate New York. His absolute authority over his followers and Mormons' refusal to separate church and state alarmed many, as did their practice of polygamous marriage, in which one man could have more than one wife. The Mormons were persecuted and driven from state to state until the Mormon leader Brigham Young led more than 10,000 Mormons to the shores of the Great Salt Lake in modern-day Utah. The case of the Mormons show really the limits of our religious toleration in 19th century America. In this section, we're going to be looking at how the market revolution affected the lives of workers, women, and African Americans. Now, with the market revolution, the right to compete for economic advancement became essential to American freedom. Symbols of liberty were bound up in symbols of prosperity. The stories of men like John Jacob Astor, the son of a poor German immigrant who later becomes the richest man in America by using money earned from shipping in order to invest in Manhattan real estate, seem to embody opportunities open to the self-made man. This success was achieved not through hereditary privilege or through government favoritism as it would have been in Europe, but instead was through hard work and intelligence. The market revolution and expanding commercial life enriched bankers, merchants, industrialists, and other planters, and it also produced a new middle class of clerks, accountants, and other professionals like teachers, doctors, and lawyers. This is Pat Lyon at the Forge. This is a painting of a prosperous blacksmith. You can see he's proud of his accomplishments as a self-made man who's achieved success through hard work and skill rather than through inheritance. Lyon asked the artist to paint him in his shop wearing his work clothes. He's very proud of the work that he has done. Now, not everyone benefited from the market revolution. In fact, most African Americans were slaves, and even free blacks were excluded from economic opportunities during this time period. Free blacks in the northern states experienced discrimination in every sphere of life. They were segregated into the poorest and most unhealthy areas of cities like New York and Philadelphia and Cincinnati, were subject to assaults and riots by white mobs. They were barred from schools and other public facilities and had created their own institutional life of schools and churches, such as the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Many blacks experienced downward economic mobility. They were unable to practice their craft skills because of discrimination by white employers and workers. They were regulated to the most unskilled and menial low-paid labor. Blacks also could not take advantage of the opening West since federal law barred blacks from even accessing public land, and some western states even prohibited them from entering their territory. This is Julian Jane Tillman. She's a preacher in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. This is 1844 engraving. Many Protestant denominations during this time period would allow women to preach, although it did cause much criticism. Now, many opportunities created by the market revolution also were closed to women. As the household declined as a site of economic production, women's traditional roles were undermined by mass-produced goods that once made at home. Some women entered factories while others embraced a new definition of femininity, that was centered in the women's ability to create a private sphere in their home, removed from the competitive tensions of the market economy. Here, her role was not to produce things, but to sustain non-market values such as love, friendship, mutual obligation, providing men with shelter from the rigors and the stresses of the market. Earlier ideas of Republican motherhood were replaced by this cult of domesticity. Virtue came to be defined as personal quality associated with women who were expected to be innocent, beautiful, frail, and very much dependent on men. The cult of domesticity minimized even women's indirect participation in public life and viewed women as nurturing, selfless, and ruled by emotion, while seeing men as rational, aggressive, and domineering. While men could move freely between the public and private spheres, women were to remain confined within the private family. Now, the cult of domesticity did not capture the realities of life for many of the women who worked for wages for at least part of their lives. Women who worked outside the home could not compete freely for jobs, since only low-paying jobs were open to them, and married women could not sign their own contracts or until after the Civil War keep wages. Those wages that they earned went to their husbands. Many poor women worked as domestic servants, factory workers, and seamstresses. For the middle class, however, respectability was earned in part by keeping wives and children at home and hiring women to do household work in the middle class homes, which were segregated into neighborhoods distant from other classes. Even working class men adopted these values and protested that capitalism was ripping women from the home and was subjecting them to exploitation and abuse in the marketplace. Now, this is an image from a female infant's 1830 birth and baptismal certificate, which shows the domestic scene with women at work while the men relax. Now, many Americans experienced the market revolution as a loss of freedom. The economy suffered a sharp recession in 1819 and a depression starting in 1837, and several downturns in between, all of which caused high levels of unemployment and reduction in wages. While the economic transformations of the market revolution greatly expanded America's output and trade increased living standards, it also widened the gap between the wealth and income of wealthy merchants, industrialists, and the workers and the poor, especially in the urban Northwest. Worried about the erosion of their traditional skills and the danger of being reduced to dependent wage earners, skilled craftsmen in the late 1820s created the world's first working man's parties. These were very short-lived political organizations that were looking to bring together lower-class support for candidates who demanded free public education, an end to being put in prison for debt, and laws that would limit the working day to 10 hours. In the 1830s, unions were organized and strikes were very common. Wage earners protesting social conditions and pressing for political demands really invoked these ideas of freedom and independence from the revolutionary era in order to justify their claims. They even compared their status to slaves using the term wage slavery. Thus, even while the market revolution offered opportunities to many Americans, it also generated a lot of anxiety and protest that came to be reflected in politics. You can see this is a political cartoon, No More Grinding the Poor, but Liberty and the Rights of Man. This is a labor movement cartoon in the 1830s. The devil and a millionaire are conspiring to buy an election with money, which is in the box to the lower left, while the honest working man hands his ballot to a female figure of liberty. The workers' motto is liberty, equality, justice, and the rights of man. And this is the shoemaker's strike in Lynn, a procession amidst of a snowstorm of 800 women operatives. This is an engraving from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, and it was first published in March 17th of 1860. The striking women are carrying a banner that's comparing their condition to that of